In this video, we're going to be looking at counting significant figures. Now, that's usually a task that requires a lot of memorization. There's usually, in most chemistry and physics books, a whole page of rules on how to count significant figures in a particular number. There is, however, a much easier way of counting significant figures, and that's what I'm going to show you in this video. It's called the Atlantic-Pacific Rule, and it relies on both a visual cue as well as a mnemonic device. So you can see here I've drawn just a very rough sketch of the United States with the Atlantic Ocean on the right side and the Pacific Ocean on the left side. Now, the Atlantic begins with A, and A also starts the word absent. And the Pacific begins with P, of course, and P also begins the word present. So we're going to use present and absent as well as Atlantic on the right side and Pacific on the left side as our cue to figuring out how to count significant figures. So let's look at a couple of examples of how to do this. Let's start with the number 1.000. So we can see in that number that the decimal is present. And because the decimal is present, we're going to start at the Pacific. Now when we start at the first non-zero digit. And the first digit on the Pacific side, the left side, is non-zero. It's a 1. So we start counting with that digit. So we've got 1, and once we start counting, we go all the way to the end. So we've got 1, 2, 3, 4. 4 sig figs in 1.000. Now, if we look at a very similar number, 1,000, that has a different scenario altogether, because in that case the decimal is absent. So we don't start on the left side, we start on the right side, on the Atlantic side. But when we start counting, we always start at the first non-zero digit. And the first digit here is a 0, so we don't start counting there. We start counting at the first non-zero, and so we wouldn't count that 0, we wouldn't count that 0, we wouldn't count that 0. We would count the 1 because that's obviously not a 0, and we're at the end of the number. Okay, so we're moving in this direction. We're starting at the Atlantic, and so 1,000 only has 1 sig fig. Let's try a third example. Let's say we have the number 0.0400. Lots of zeros here. It gets kind of complicated if you try to apply the rules in your textbook, but with the Atlantic-Pacific rule it's much simpler. Since the decimal is present, we start at the Pacific coast, which is right here, but we don't start counting until we get to the first non-zero digit. So that first 0 isn't counted, second 0 isn't counted. Once we get to the 4, now we start counting, and now it's just counting all the way to the other coast. So 1, 2, 3, that number has 3 significant figures. Let's try one last example with the number 40150. Okay, so there's no decimal present. The decimal's absent. Since the decimal is absent, we're going to start at the Atlantic coast. And here, we don't start counting, even though we start here at the Atlantic, we don't start, which is the right side obviously, we don't count that first 0 because we don't start counting until we get to a non-zero digit. Once we get to the non-zero digit, then we just count all the way to the end. There's no difference at that point once you start counting between a 0 and any other digit. So we've got 1, 2, 3, 4. 40,150 has 4 Sig Figs. I hope this video has made counting significant figures an easier task for you.